One of the things that's really exciting about being an ancient historian is that we're actually learning a lot that we didn't know before about the human past, even human past that's thousands of years separated from us. And it's not just the continued discovery of new documents, although we do continue to find new evidence of a kind of traditional type, but we're actually acquiring new evidence of a totally novel, non-traditional type from the natural sciences. And that includes paleoclimate evidence about what the physical environment was like, how the climate has changed and varied over time. And it includes DNA evidence, biological evidence, evidence from archaeological samples from skeletons that tell us about the people, but also the pathogens that existed in the past. The fate of Rome is the story of the fall of the Roman Empire, one of the really classical historical questions. How does an empire that's one of the most dominant, powerful empires that any human civilization has ever created, how does it fall? How does it cease to be a dominant political entity? And my theory is that to tell this story right, we have to include the powerful force of the natural physical environment. And that includes climate change, and that includes biological events, pandemic diseases that played an enormous role in helping to undermine Rome's power. And a good example of this is the first pandemic event, the first plague pandemic that erupts in 541. It's called the Plague of Justinian. It is the bubonic plague. It's one of the most devastating pathogens that humanity's ever faced. And yet, even though our historical records describe the horrific effects of this pandemic, the historical record only exists for certain parts of the world. And even within the former Roman Empire, the evidence we have is actually very biased towards large cities and towards particularly one city, Constantinople, which was then the capital of Rome. And it was just a lingering question: how important was the plague outside of the areas where we happen to have historical records? And it's a very hard question to answer. And now we're starting to be able to answer that question from the DNA evidence. The DNA of the bacterium that caused the pandemic has been found from skeletons in mass graves, from places far outside Constantinople, from tiny villages in southern Germany that are nowhere near the center of power or trade, and that tell us that if the plague had reached places like this, then it must truly have reached almost everywhere. And it helps us take the written record, which gives us a sense of what it was like where it struck, and to be able to say, okay, this actually struck in places that are totally dark in the historical record, and to combine those together to start to get a sense of what a catastrophe this event really was. Well, we all know that we live in a world where we're very concerned with the effects of climate change, and have a deep need to understand how the climate system is changing, which requires a sense of how it works. And the climate is certainly being altered by human activity, by pollution of greenhouse gases. But the climate system also has a background level of variability and change. The climate system wasn't simply unchanging until human activity started changing it. And because it's become so important to understand that natural background, there's been a huge effort over the last generation to try and understand how the climate system naturally works and what the past states of the climate have looked like. And so Earth scientists have looked at ice cores, which are a record of the chemistry of the atmosphere in a way, on a year-by-year basis, going back thousands and thousands of years. They've looked at tree rings. Similarly, when a tree's growth can tell you about temperature or precipitation, it can be a very, very detailed, high-resolution record of the past climate. And lake records, ocean records, pollen records, all of these have their contribution to make to a deeper understanding of how the Earth's climate has changed over past times. And so for historians, this is really interesting because it turns out that the kind of timescales that we're interested in, the rise and fall of civilizations, that the climate changes on those timescales. It changes on annual, it changes on decadal, on centennial, scales, and these changes have had really important consequences. And so for my period, I'm interested in the Roman Empire. And it turns out that at various times in Roman history, climate change was a very important force. It could either stabilize and contribute to the success of the Romans when the climate was favorable, but it could also challenge the Romans. It could induce famine or drought. It could induce migrations and kind of geopolitical challenges that the Romans found very difficult to manage. So the climate, I think, has been an important part of human history from the very beginning. A great example of this is a volcanic eruption that happened in the year 536 AD. The written record, the historical sources, actually widely testify to a really weird climate that year. It was very anomalous. They described a year without the summer, 18 months when the sun was invisible. And now it turns out that we have both ice core and tree ring records that help us understand what our human witnesses were observing. They didn't understand what they were experiencing, but now we know that in 536 there was a large volcanic eruption somewhere in the northern hemisphere that caused the sun to appear dimmed for apparently quite some period of time. And so you have that synthesis of the human observation and the physical testimony. And that was followed a few years later in 540 by another massive volcanic eruption in the tropics. And this two eruption event caused massive and instantaneous effects in the climate system. It became cooler immediately. And the decade that followed the first eruption is actually probably the coldest decade in the last several thousand years. And it caused all kinds of challenges for the people who experienced it. I hope that if we tell the story of the fall of the Roman Empire and we include these fascinating new kinds of evidence, the paleoclimate evidence, the DNA evidence, that we can make the story richer. And there's always a kind of fascination about Rome. There's something about this civilization that speaks to us, and it always has. It's always been that way. The powerful imagery of this civilization, the poignant visions of its ruins, that they're still there when you go to the city of Rome or all around the old Roman Empire. It sort of captures the imagination, and that's because there's something so human about it. How could an empire, a civilization that was this powerful, have simply transformed beyond recognition? And I hope that by telling a story the way that I've tried to, and including nature, including the role of climate change, including the role of pandemic disease, that we see that the human story has always been about our relationship with nature. And in this most important chapter of the past that has this powerful emotional appeal to us, if we get the story right and we realize that our civilization's fate is always bound up with our relationship with the natural world, then I think it changes your perspective. Our world's very different from the Romans, and what happened to them is not exactly what's going to happen to us. But I think it can change the way we think of ourselves, the way we think of our societies, and deepen our sense of how interconnected we are to the physical and biological environment.